Turkish police raided the headquarters of the country's largest circulation newspaper, Zaman.
Zaman gazetesinde bünyesinde bulunduran Feza gazeteciliğe kayyım atanmasından
protesters had been shouting for democracy and free speech.
Bunun talebi üzerine Zaman gazetesine kayyum atandı.
The latest troubling actions by the Turkish government against press freedom.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. These are some of the stories we're looking at this week. The media war in Turkey, the country's biggest newspaper taken over by the government, along with a news agency and a TV channel, knocked off the air. We speak with a news editor just out of jail. He says things are probably going to get worse. The Washington Post says it's not out to get Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Its critics would disagree. And a recipe idea for filmmakers who want to get their idea on the front burner. This past week, Turkish authorities raided and seized control of the country's largest daily newspaper, Zaman, its sister publication, Today's Zaman, and the Cihan news agency. 3 body blows to the Fourth Estate in Turkey. Journalists thrown out of their jobs said that overnight Zaman was turned into a government mouthpiece. The paper is allied with a Turkish religious leader living in the U.S., Fethullah Gulen, who's a former ally of President Tayyip Erdogan. Other media organizations with links to the Gulen movement have been raided and taken over in the past year, but there's more to the media story in Turkey right now than a settling of scores between Erdogan and Gulen. Last year, the government accused 2 editors from the Cumhuriyet newspaper of treason for publishing information about weapons transfers by the Turkish Secret Service to rebel fighters in Syria. Then, when Turkey's highest court ordered their release from prison, President Erdogan announced that he would not respect the ruling, effectively setting the stage for a showdown between the government, the courts, and the media. As for outside pressure on President Erdogan, his critics say there's simply not enough of it. And they blame that on the wider refugee story. The European Union needs Turkey these days, they say, to help limit the flow of refugees into the EU. So European leaders are going easy on the president. Later in this broadcast, a feature interview with Dunder, the Cumhuriyet editor whose fate, depending on who you believe, rests either with the courts or the president. But first, the wider media story in Turkey, including some of the voices the government's just silenced. Our starting point this week is Istanbul. The front page of Zaman, Turkey's biggest selling paper, on Saturday, March 5th, was dressed in black. The headline says the Constitution is suspended. The next day's paper had a much brighter outlook, featuring a smiling president talking about the historical excitement around a new bridge project. What happened? This.
The government has seized control of the country's biggest newspaper.
Riot police pushed through the crowd with water cannon and tear gas.
Zaman gazetesine kayyum atandı.
The paper is under new management after what might be described as a hostile takeover.
The brutal crackdown was almost expected. It was a matter of time because for the last 2.5 years, the government has been targeting our media group by means of smear campaigns. Pro-government columnists, actually I call them the hitmen of the government, have been encouraging the AKP to target Zaman Media Group.
This is the final stage to change the media structure, ownership structure in Turkey. This is sad, this is tragic in a way. This is a step to change the editorial line altogether, which it did actually, because if we see 2 coverages of the Zaman newspaper, one day before the takeover and the next day, of course there's a huge difference.
I mean, I can't even find the right word. It's somehow funny. I mean, how would a Zaman reader react to the drastic change of the political line of the newspaper? Nobody takes it serious. Not even people who are supporting Erdogan would take it serious. You change the management of the newspaper and you change the newspaper's policy and oops, everything will be changed. No, you cannot stop opposition. No way.
The takeovers at Zaman, Zaman Today, and the Cihan news agency represent one front in the media war being waged in Turkey between the government and Gulenists. Fethullah Gulen, the Islamic cleric living in the U.S., was a key supporter of Tayyip Erdogan until they fell out 3 years ago. The news outlets affiliated with Gulen and what Turks call the Hizmet movement supported Erdogan too, and the government left them alone. But the fallout happened and the coverage changed, particularly in 2013, when the Gulenist media broke stories alleging corruption in Erdogan's family. Then the Gulen group of outlets suddenly found themselves accused of financial irregularities. Jane Kandur is a columnist at Sabah and a member of the ruling AK party.
I don't think that last Friday was one of the darkest days in Turkish press history. Zaman Group, which owns Zaman paper, was taken under trusteeship because there were questions about its financial dealings. It has not been taken over. If the courts rule that there is no financial misdoings, it will be given back to the owners. But we have to remember that this is a movement that has been investigated for financial misdoings in America and other countries as well. So it's not actually surprising that it's happened in Turkey.
Everything that is going on in Turkey, all lawlessness, violations of human rights, violation of media freedoms, they all boil down to the corruption investigation of 2013. Because the corruption investigations allegedly implicated Erdogan's family, in order to distract attention from those corruption investigations, he needed a scapegoat. And that scapegoat turned out to be the Hizmet movement. And unfortunately, a significant portion of the Turkish people bought this argument.
According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, only 3 countries, China, Egypt, and Iran, have more media workers in prison than Turkey does. The Turkish Journalists Union reports that 33 are currently behind bars. The majority of them are Kurds, reporting in the southeast. Censorship and blocking of Kurdish news platforms has become routine. Since the fighting flared up in Kurdistan last year, DIHA, the largest Kurdish news agency, has had its site blocked 29 times. Another news agency, Firat, and the biggest-selling Kurdish paper, Özgür Gündem, also had their websites closed when the fighting began. They can be seen from outside Turkey, but not from within the country. Then there's the case of IMC TV, a channel based in Istanbul that focuses on Kurdish issues. On March 4th, on the orders of prosecutors in Ankara, Turksat, the state-owned satellite company, dropped IMC, relegating it to terrestrial and online access only. And the plug was pulled on the channel during an interview with 2 newspaper editors from Cumhuriyet, who are clearly unpopular with President Erdogan. Banu Güven was conducting the interview just before the channel went to black.
It was like 3 p.m. where I had Dunder and Erdem Gül on air, and probably someone called Turksat and asked them why our channel was still on air.
Yayınımız şu anda kesilmiş, evet. Arkadaşlarım kulağıma şu anda bu bilgiyi veriyorlar.
And it may have taken maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes until they dropped us from the satellite.
Nedeninin ne olduğunu şu an bilmiyoruz. Ama tahmin edebiliyoruz.
I strongly believe that the timing was in relation with this live interview I was conducting with Can Dündar and Erdem Gül.
When that interview took place, Can Dündar, the editor of Cumhuriyet, and Erdem Gül, the paper's Ankara bureau chief, were fresh out of jail. The charges were espionage and terror-related and came after President Erdogan promised to make them pay for their journalism.
Bu haberi özel haber olarak yapan kişi de öyle zannediyorum ki bunun bedelini ağır ödeyecek.
When the Constitutional Court freed the 2 men last month, the president said he would not abide by the court's decision. The matter is now in the hands of a lower court, and in Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey, who knows what happens next.
He spoke as an individual. As far as I know, I'm not a lawyer, but the objection that was made by some people is that the lower courts should have arrived at a decision first, and then an appeal would have been made to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court, by making a ruling, has made any decision the lower courts make a moot point.
So let's focus on Erdogan's statement, because he's openly leading the courts, which is unconstitutional, because according to the Turkish constitution, nobody, let alone a president, could give court instructions. And in this case, clearly Erdogan has been interfering with the court's decision and has been saying that he doesn't recognize the court's decision. This is another alarming signal that the constitution has been violated in Turkey.
One final note. Brussels hosted a news event this past week involving European heads of government. The EU has been among President Erdogan's toughest critics on freedom of the press, but that's not what the meeting was about. It was on how to limit the flow of Syrian refugees coming through Turkey into Europe. Turkey, represented by Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, held most of the cards, and everyone at the meeting knew it. It ended with the EU cutting Turkey a check for 3 billion euros, along with promises to make it easier for Turks to get visas to enter the EU. All that talk we used to hear from Brussels on Turkey's lamentable record on media freedom, how it fails to measure up to the values Europeans are said to cherish, didn't make it onto the official agenda. And the Turkish news media, what's left of them, were all over the story. On the download now, our reviewers weigh in on the political and legal battle over the media in Turkey.
Turkish decision makers, military, government, other bodies of decision making, they unanimously agree that Fethullah Gulen movement and PKK are dangerous threats to Turkish unity, and they must be dealt with. The government is building solid cases against their members, including their journalists. The same crackdown process actually is going on against the PKK terrorist organization, against its media like the IMC TV that openly does PKK propaganda.
More than the raid on the newspaper Zaman and the takeover, more shocking than that was the decision of the EU to really turn a blind eye on Turkey's deteriorating press freedom record and basically letting President Erdogan and his government continue doing whatever it wants within the country.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. Hassan Hanafi, a Somali journalist, was once a respected broadcaster. This week, a Somali court found him guilty of colluding with al-Shabaab in masterminding and executing the murder of several journalists. He was sentenced to death. Hanafi made his name working with a radio station, Quran FM, before moving on to Radio Andalus, which is known as a mouthpiece for the al-Shabaab militant group. He fled to Kenya, but was found there and arrested in 2014 and extradited back to Somalia. The court was told that Hanafi monitored al-Shabaab's media coverage and threatened journalists who reported on the group critically. He was convicted of killing one reporter personally and of involvement in another 5 cases. 46 journalists have been killed in Somalia over the past 10 years. The Thai government has dropped a bizarre legal case against a photojournalist who was arrested last year for carrying a flak jacket and a helmet through the airport in Bangkok. Anthony Kwan Hokchun, a journalist based in Hong Kong working for a media group called Initium, had been in Thailand last August covering the aftermath of a bombing there. He says he brought the safety gear in because of the nature of the story and was then arrested on his way out of the country. Under Thai law, helmets and flak jackets are classified as weapons, and violations of the law restricting them are punishable by up to 5 years in jail. Kwan spent a night in prison before being bailed, then another 6 months waiting for the trial before the government finally dumped the case. Thailand has been under military rule for almost 2 years now, and reporters working there have a litany of complaints, ranging from new red lines for their journalism to new visa restrictions on foreign reporters. Over the past year, 10 journalists have had visa requests denied. The Washington Post found itself answering some questions this past week over its coverage of Democratic presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders after a flurry of stories, not many of which could be described as positive. 16 stories in 16 hours by Post reporters, editorial writers, as well as op-ed pieces by academics, even one by a video editor. The deluge of Sanders' stories was spotted by the New York-based media watch group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which pointed out that most of the pieces had a negative slant or questioned the substance or viability of Sanders' policies. After FAIR published its critique, the Post's national editor argued our coverage of the Sanders campaign has been committed, extensive and fair. Sustained scrutiny should be expected by Senator Sanders. The Washington Post was bought in 2013 by Amazon.com founder Jeff Bezos, who's reportedly a libertarian and who, as FAIR put it, might not be a big fan of the democratic socialism espoused by Bernie Sanders. All of this followed a column that the Post's editorial board published 6 weeks ago, headlined, "Bernie Sanders, Fiction-Filled Campaign." Asked about that back then, Sanders replied, "Check out where all the geniuses on the editorial board were with regard to the invasion." of Iraq. We're going to delve deeper into the media story in Turkey now with someone who's got a lot riding on it. Cihan Dunder, the editor-in-chief of Cumhuriyet, which after the takeover of Zaman is now the biggest opposition newspaper in the country. 10 months ago, Dunder published that story about Turkish intelligence trucks allegedly carrying weapons to rebels in Syria. President Erdogan's promise that, quote, the person who wrote this story will pay a heavy price for it. I won't let him go unpunished, sent chills across the Turkish media landscape. The specific charges that followed against Dunder and his Ankara bureau chief, Erdem Gül, included espionage, revealing classified information, and membership in a terrorist organization. The two men then spent 92 days behind bars before the Constitutional Court ruling that set them free. Another lower court will decide in a couple of weeks, March 25th, if their freedom is to last. And the president has made it clear that this case is not closed. I spoke with Cihan Dunder from his home in Istanbul. He spoke in Turkish. He told us he wanted to make sure that he didn't miss out on any details by speaking in English, which is a second language for him. I started out by asking him about February 26th, the day he was released after 3 months in prison.
Tabii en başta ailem vardı.
Firstly, and most importantly, my family were there, as were my colleagues and lawyers. Then there were those who fight for freedom in Turkey on a daily basis, the people who have been waiting near to the prison gates, supporting us throughout this period. The joy we shared in that moment was not only about our release, but the feeling that something good was happening in Turkey. After being held in solitary confinement for 3 months, this was a very exciting time for us.
Müthiş bize de heyecan verdi.
That story that you published in Cumhuriyet back in May of last year when you alleged that Turkish intelligence trucks were smuggling arms to rebels in Syria, do you still stand by that story? And is there anything you can add to it now that you couldn't include when you first published?
Elbette haberimin arkasındayım. Son derece de önemli.
Of course, I'm still defending my story. I wish it had never been censored. Then the public would have seen how this country is being dragged through the mud. The Turkish government has been transferring ammunition to Syria without the public knowing anything about it. In order to sweep this under the rug, the government censored the story and arrested us. This is a big cover-up, and I don't regret exposing it at all. But I would like to know where those weapons were delivered and how they were used. In the coming days, it will be our duty to investigate these angles further.
Zannediyorum önümüzdeki dönemde bize düşen biraz bunları araştırmak olacak.
Now, President Erdogan took that story personally, and he made it personal in return. He vowed that you would pay a heavy price. How much of what has followed, the charges, your imprisonment, has been a result of how the Turkish state sees the media? And how much of this, do you think, comes down to President Erdogan himself?
Bu neredeyse Erdoğan'ın kişisel bir sırrı gibi.
Erdogan treated this as though it was his personal secret that we had revealed. We exposed Turkey's involvement in the Syrian war, and that's why he was so furious. Even our 3-month prison term has not calmed him. He's still working to put us back in jail. This is important as it sends a chill to the whole journalistic community.
Dışarıda kalan gazetecilere gözdağı olması açısından önemi var.
Now, you were released after a ruling by the Constitutional Court that said that your freedom of expression had been violated, as had freedom of the press. The president responded saying he does not, quote, abide by that decision or respect it. Is there a reckoning that is looming now between the government, the courts, and the news media there?
Cumhuriyet tarihinde, Türkiye tarihinde, belki dünya tarihinde ilk kez...
This is the first time in Turkish history, maybe world history, that a president has openly declared he will not obey the decision of the Constitutional Court. According to constitutional law, this is a crime. Erdogan must follow the laws and there is no other option. Normally in democracies, presidents encourage the rule of law. But in Turkey today, it's we, the public, who had to say that Erdogan must follow these rules. The regime in Turkey has been turned upside down, and we are now struggling for our democratic rights under this authoritarian leader.
Bizim bir demokrasi mücadelesi verdiğimizi çok daha iyi anlatıyor.
There's your case. There's the closing of Cihan News Agency, IMC TV being taken off the air, what happened at Zaman. The question about this recent offensive against the news media in Turkey isn't why, Mr. Dunder. The question is, why now?
Zaman gazetesinin tam da bugün olması...
The raid on Zaman coincided with Turkey's negotiations with the EU. Europe is so deeply immersed in its migration crisis that is not paying attention to the big stick Erdogan is holding in his hand. Erdogan has leverage right now. He can threaten to open the borders if the government is criticized, and then the EU will have to deal with more refugees on European soil. That's why Erdogan has been bold enough to launch these media attacks in such a short space of time. Attacks on media will only accelerate. That's my expectation.
Dolayısıyla bu eğilim giderek tırmanacaktır gibi görüyorum.
Your story has received international attention. Zaman's story is on the pages of the New York Times, but many of the journalists imprisoned in Turkey are lesser-known Kurdish journalists reporting on the conflict in the southeast. Their legal cases receive very little, if any, coverage. And I'm wondering, what are journalists like you doing to report that story? Do you feel a sense of solidarity with them and a duty to report on their legal cases?
Kesinlikle biz ne yazık ki Türkiye'deki tutuklu
Certainly, we have become symbolic for all journalists imprisoned in Turkey. This does give us certain advantages, but it also brings responsibilities which we must fulfill. We need to be their voice. We need to tell the world that Turkey is an open prison. That's why we are going to Diyarbakir next week to show our solidarity with our colleagues reporting in the southeast. This is not just for freedom of journalists. It has consequences for everyone in the country. If we win, everybody will be freed, not just journalists.
Sadece gazeteciler değil, hepimiz özgür olacağız.
How much support have you received, Mr. Dunder, from the rest of the Turkish media, or have they been scared silent on this story?
Maalesef açıkçası Avrupa...
Unfortunately, I have received much more support from European media than Turkish media. I can partly understand this. There is immense pressure. Some of the journalists who would normally criticize this case are already behind bars, while others are unemployed. In the last 2-3 years, the pressure has become unbearable. In this environment, it's a pipe dream to expect a good level of support. In spite of this, my colleagues have supported us as much as they can. But I must reiterate one point. This is a struggle for democracy, and as soon as we break through this barrier of fear, people will learn to write freely once again.
Sıfırdan korkusuz yazıp çizmeyi en baştan öğrenmeye başlayacaklar.
Given all that's happening, and with your criminal court hearing coming up on March 25th, has anyone advised you to, despite the travel ban, get out of Turkey while you still can?
Elbette bunu çok söyleyenler oluyor çünkü...
Of course, so many people have said this to me. The common belief here in Turkey is that if the president files a case against you, there is no way you can escape a prison term. I reject these beliefs. We are not criminals. This government may want us to leave the country, but I would prefer to be in prison. Showing bravery, standing tall against all these pressures actually creates more trouble for Erdogan. This is something I realized after my recent arrest. I will go to jail before leaving this country.
Tutuklanmayı tercih ederim ülkeyi terk etmektense.
Can Dunder of Cumhuriyet, thanks for speaking to us at the Listening Post today. We hope to do this again sometime soon.
Çok teşekkürler.
Finally, if you want that little video you're working on to go viral, there are a few simple rules. One of them goes like this. Lock your camera into position above a wooden table and then film yourself cooking something. Recipe videos are invading our news feeds, and the top 3 video pages on Facebook right now are all cooking pages. Red Sky Studios, which is a post-production company based in Birmingham, Alabama, brought the same approach to film production. It took the cooking model to teach filmmakers how to bake your own epic film. The level of difficulty here, very hard. The cooking time, months, sometimes years, or forever. The title of their little video, Recipe for Disaster, and yes, it's gone viral. We'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.